Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight we are going to lie very still and think about stone that learned to hold the shape of eternity. The pyramids of Egypt are not simply buildings. They are something closer to frozen breath, a held exhale from a civilization that looked up at the endless sky and decided that a human life, however short, deserved a shape that would never fall down. Imagine a mountain that a person built on purpose, block by block, not because they had to, but because they wanted something in this world that time could not easily erase. That is what we're wandering into tonight. You may have had a long day. Your mind may still be turning over conversations, tasks, small worries that don't have edges you can hold on to. That's all right. You don't need cosmic mysteries or ancient deserts to be interesting to you right now. You just need somewhere soft to rest your attention while your body remembers how to let go. That's exactly what this is for. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. We're not in any hurry. We'll wander gently through the sand and the stone, through workers' villages and painted ceilings and quiet burial chambers. And if you fall asleep in the middle of a sentence, that sentence will still be here, waiting the next time you want it. Nothing here needs to be remembered. If these gentle journeys ever help you rest, a quiet like or a subscribe helps other sleepy souls find their way here too. But that's only if it feels easy. Nothing tonight is asking anything of you. So let's begin the way we always do, by coming home to your own body first. Let your shoulders soften just slightly away from your ears. You don't have to force this. Just notice where you're holding on and let a little of that grip loosen. Let your jaw unclench. Let your tongue rest heavy in your mouth. Let your hands go loose, palms soft, fingers uncurling like something that has finally been set down after being carried too long. Let your breathing slow, not by trying, but by allowing. In through the nose, slow, and out even slower, like a tide going out, and taking a little tension with it each time. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow every sentence. There is no test at the end of this, no quiz, no one checking whether you were paying attention. You are allowed to drift away completely and come back, or not come back at all. Nothing here is a task. Your only job tonight is to be a body, breathing, warm, unwinding. The day is behind you now. It doesn't need holding anymore. So let your mind drift as we begin to wander through the stone. Long before pyramids existed, the Egyptians buried their dead in the sand itself, wrapped and laid low. And the hot, dry ground did something the wet climates of other lands could never do. It preserved. It kept the body whole. Somewhere in that discovery, a quiet idea was born. This place, this dry, golden country, might be a place where things did not have to end the way they ended elsewhere. A mound of sand over a grave is a small thing, a shape that says, Something is buried here, and someone thought it mattered. Over centuries, that mound became a low brick structure, then a stepped one, then a smooth one, each generation adding permanence, the way you might add another blanket on a cold night, not out of urgency, but out of care. The pyramid, when it finally arrived, was simply the sand mound's most patient descendant. A shape the desert had been quietly suggesting all along. Your own body came from something small too, a single cell, dividing quietly in the dark, long before you had a shape anyone could recognize. Tonight, whatever shape you've become, you can let it rest the way that first small mound rested under an ancient sky, unhurried, undisturbed, simply being. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The very first pyramid was not smooth-sided at all. It looked like a staircase reaching toward the sky, built for a pharaoh named Djoser almost 4,500 years ago. And it was designed by a man whose name has actually survived across all that time, Imhotep. Think about that softly for a second. Most names from that era have long since dissolved into silence, worn away like footprints on a beach. His did not. Imhotep began, it's believed, as an architect working in mud brick, the ordinary material of ordinary buildings. But for his king's tomb, he reached for something that would not crumble the way mud brick eventually does stone, cut and stacked in 6 enormous steps, each one smaller than the one below it, like a staircase built for a giant to climb toward the stars. It rose over 60 meters into the desert air, taller than anything human hands had built before it. People who saw it must have felt something we rarely get to feel now. The sensation of watching a completely new kind of shape enter the world for the first time. You've had moments like that too, small ones maybe. A first glimpse of the ocean, a first snowfall, the particular quiet of seeing something for which you had no prior comparison. Let that same soft astonishment settle over you now, low and slow, like dust after a very old wind. But that is only one small part of the story. The Great Pyramid at Giza, the one most people picture when they hear the word pyramid, was built a little later for a king named Khufu, and it is made of a truly staggering number of stone blocks, somewhere over 2 million of them. Try not to picture the number itself. Numbers like that don't really mean anything to a tired mind late at night. Picture instead a single block, roughly the size of a large refrigerator, and then imagine placing one down every few minutes, day and night, for over 20 years. Imagine that patience. Imagine that rhythm over and over, block after block after block, like breathing. Each stone weighed, on average, about as much as a small car, some far more. And yet the pyramid rose with a kind of astonishing precision, its base almost perfectly level, its four sides almost perfectly aligned to true north, south, east, and west, at a time long before compasses existed. Somehow, by watching stars circle slowly overhead night after night, the builders found true direction using nothing but patient observation and the sky itself. There is something quietly moving about that direction, true direction, can be found simply by watching long enough without hurrying. Your own mind, right now, doesn't need to hurry towards sleep either. It only needs to keep watching the slow turning of this voice, the way ancient eyes once watched the slow turning of the stars. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. For a very long time, people imagined the pyramids being built by armies of enslaved people, driven by whips under a brutal sun. It's a dramatic image, but it isn't what the evidence actually tells us. Archaeologists digging near the Giza pyramids uncovered something quieter, and in its own way more remarkable, a whole town built to house the workers. Bakeries, breweries, bedrooms, bones showing evidence of broken limbs that had healed under careful medical attention. These were not the remains of the discarded. They were the remains of people who had been fed, housed, and cared for while they worked, skilled laborers and seasonal farmers who came, it seems, largely by choice, some perhaps for pay, some as part of a kind of civic duty tied to the king, in rotating shifts, especially during the months when the Nile flooded their fields and made farming impossible anyway. Building a king's eternal home, it turns out, may have simply been what many people did between harvests. Even the food tells its own story, the remains of enormous quantities of bread and beer, staples that fed thousands of hands, day after day, meal after meal. Ordinary nourishment, holding up something extraordinary. Much like your own quiet, ordinary breath is holding up this whole rested body of yours right now, without needing any credit for it. But that is only one small part of the story. Imagine, for a moment, what the Great Pyramid actually looked like when it was finished, because it did not look the way it looks today. Today it is rough, tan, weathered, beautiful, but worn like an old hand. When it was new, it was covered entirely in polished white limestone casing stones, cut so precisely and fitted so closely together that some ancient accounts describe barely being able to slide a knife blade between them. Picture that surface catching the early morning sun, smooth, brilliant, blinding white, rising out of golden sand like something not quite of this earth. At its very peak sat a capstone, called a pyramidion, likely covered in gold or electrum, a pale gold-silver alloy, so that the very tip of the pyramid would have caught the first and last light of each day and thrown it back like a small, steady star fixed atop a mountain of white stone. Most of that casing is gone now, quarried away centuries later for other buildings, the way old coats sometimes get repurposed into new ones. But if you let yourself imagine it as it once was gleaming whole, catching the light, you might feel, just faintly, what people 4,000 years ago must have felt looking up at it for the first time. A held breath, a quiet kind of awe that didn't need explaining. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Inside the Great Pyramid, deep within all that stone, there is a passage called the Grand Gallery, a long, soaring corridor with a ceiling that rises higher and higher as you walk through it, narrowing slightly toward the top like the inside of a held breath. It leads, eventually, to the king's chamber, a room built entirely of dark red granite, quarried hundreds of miles to the south, and carried down the Nile on barges built just to carry it. Granite is heavier and harder than the limestone that makes up most of the pyramid, and using it here, deep in the pyramid's core, seems to have been deliberate. A way of protecting the most important chamber with the strongest stone available. Above the king's chamber, hidden from view, sit several small relieving chambers, stacked one atop another, their only purpose being to shift the enormous weight of the stone above away from the ceiling below, so the chamber would not, over time, simply collapse under its own mass. It's a strange kind of tenderness, isn't it? Building protection you'll never see, purely so something fragile beneath it can rest undisturbed for thousands of years. Your own body does something similar for you every night, quietly working beneath your awareness so that the fragile, tired parts of you can finally be still. But that is only one small part of the story. Somewhere near the base of several pyramids, archaeologists have found long, narrow pits, and inside some of them, disassembled wooden boats, taken apart piece by piece and buried in careful order, as if waiting to be reassembled. One such boat, found near the Great Pyramid, was pieced back together painstakingly over years, plank by ancient plank, until it once again became a full, elegant vessel over 40 meters long, its wood still faintly fragrant with cedar after more than 4,000 years underground. These were not simply boats for this life. They were built, it's believed, for the journey after, vessels meant to carry the pharaoh's spirit across the sky each day alongside the sun. The way the sun itself was imagined to sail across the heavens in its own boat, sinking each evening only to be reborn each dawn. A boat buried in stillness, meant for a voyage that was never meant to be seen by living eyes. There's something gentle in that image worth carrying with you tonight, the idea that stillness and voyage aren't opposites. You can lie here, completely motionless and still, in some quiet corner of your mind, be sailing somewhere peaceful. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Later pyramids, smaller and less famous than the ones at Giza, hold something the earlier ones did not: words. Carved into the interior walls of the pyramid built for a king named Unas are hundreds of columns of hieroglyphic text, now known as the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious writings in the world. They are spells, essentially, instructions and blessings meant to help the king's spirit rise safely into the sky, to become a star, to join the gods. Some of the lines speak of the king climbing a ladder to heaven. Others speak of him becoming one with Orion, or crossing a reed-lined river in the sky, the way the living crossed the Nile. They were never meant for human eyes at all. They were meant only for the dead king and the gods, private words carved in stone, sealed away in darkness, spoken to no living audience. There's something quietly moving about words written with no expectation of ever being read by the living. Whatever you're carrying tonight that feels too private or too tangled to say out loud, you don't have to say it either. It can simply exist, held gently, the way those ancient words were held in the dark for thousands of years, asking nothing of anyone. But that is only one small part of the story. Before the smooth-sided pyramid became the standard, a king named Sneferu, Khufu's father, seems to have spent much of his reign simply learning how to build one, through trial and very visible error. His first attempt, now called the bent pyramid, changes angle partway up its height, shifting from a steep slope to a much gentler one, as though the builders realized midway through construction that the original angle was too steep to be safe, and adjusted the plan right there, mid-build, stone by stone. His next attempt, the red pyramid, named for the rusty hue of its exposed stone, got the angle right from the base to the top. The first true, fully smooth-sided pyramid in history. It isn't as famous as Giza, and it rarely appears on postcards, but in its own quiet way, it may be the more remarkable structure. Proof that greatness sometimes comes only after visible, humble failure, corrected patiently, without shame. If tonight some part of your day feels unfinished, uneven, a little bent out of shape, you can let it be exactly that. Even pyramids needed practice. Even kings adjusted the angle partway up. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Somewhere on the underside of the massive stone blocks that make up the pyramids, invisible from the ground, workers left small traces of themselves, quick marks scrawled in red or black paint, naming the work gangs who hauled and placed each stone. Names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkora have been found on hidden surfaces, cheerful and irreverent, never meant to be seen again once the stone was set in place. These weren't formal inscriptions meant to honor the king. They were closer to graffiti, a kind of proof of presence, left by ordinary people who wanted some small trace of themselves folded into something eternal, even if no one would ever read it. A private joke, a team's nickname, a little human warmth sealed forever into cold stone. You don't need anyone to see the small, quiet parts of you either, the tired jokes, the private nicknames you've given yourself, the little proofs that you were here, doing your best today. They can stay sealed away too, safe and unseen, and still matter. But that is only one small part of the story. Moving the stone itself was its own quiet feat of ingenuity. For the heaviest blocks, some of the granite pieces in the king's chamber weighed as much as 80 tons, roughly the weight of a loaded jumbo jet. Workers likely used wooden sledges, dragged over specially prepared surfaces. Wall paintings from ancient Egypt show teams of men hauling colossal statues on sledges, while a single figure stands at the front, pouring liquid, likely water, onto the sand just ahead of the sledge's path. For a long time, no one quite understood why. Then researchers discovered something almost playful in its simplicity. Wetting dry desert sand just enough changes its physical behavior entirely. Cutting the friction against a sledge's runners roughly in half. Too dry, and sand grips and resists. Too wet, and it turns to useless mud. But just damp enough, sand becomes almost slick, almost cooperative, letting enormous weights glide with far less effort than anyone pulling the ropes might expect. It's a small, human kind of cleverness, noticing that the world, handled gently, and at just the right moment, sometimes gives way more easily than force alone ever could. Your own tired mind might be the same tonight. Not something to drag by force into sleep, but something to dampen gently, quietly, until it simply begins to glide. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The great blocks of granite used deep inside several pyramids didn't come from anywhere near Giza at all. They were quarried nearly 500 miles to the south, near a city called Aswan, where the Nile narrows and ancient stoneworkers cut directly into solid rock. In the unfinished obelisk that still lies there today, cracked before it could ever be freed from the quarry, you can see the shallow grooves where workers pounded with hand-sized balls of an even harder stone called dolerite. Slowly, patiently, wearing channels into the granite over what must have been months of steady, repetitive labor. Once freed, these enormous stones were loaded onto barges built specifically to carry weights that would sink almost any other kind of vessel, and floated hundreds of miles downstream on the Nile's current, timed carefully to the season of the flood, when the river rose high enough to carry such cargo close to the building site itself. A river doing quietly, patiently, what no team of men alone could manage, carrying the impossible gently on its back. There's something worth borrowing from that tonight. You don't have to carry everything alone either. Some weights are meant to be set down onto something larger than yourself, something with its own steady current, and simply carried the rest of the way. But that is only one small part of the story. The Great Pyramid's 4 sides, remarkably, are aligned to true north, south, east, and west with an accuracy of a fraction of a degree. A level of precision that modern surveying equipment would be proud of, achieved with nothing but patient skywatching and simple tools. One leading theory suggests the builders tracked two particular stars as they circled the northern sky each night, waiting for the exact moment they aligned vertically, and used that moment to fix true north on the ground below. Imagine the quiet discipline that would take returning night after night, in the cool dark after the heat of the day had passed, to watch the same small patch of sky, waiting patiently for 2 points of light to fall into a perfectly straight line. Not rushing it, not forcing an answer before the sky was ready to give one. Sometimes the most important things can't be hurried, only waited for, with soft attention and an open, unbothered patience. Sleep is often like that too. It doesn't come because you demand it. It comes because you simply stay soft and watch the dark, unhurried, the way those ancient eyes once watched the slow turning of the stars. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The Great Sphinx, that vast reclining figure with a lion's body and a human face, sits near the Giza pyramids, gazing eastward, forever watching the sunrise. It was carved not by stacking blocks, but by carving away, cut directly from a single mound of natural limestone bedrock left over after the surrounding stone had been quarried away for the pyramids. In a sense, the Sphinx is the pyramid's shadow made solid, formed from the very rock that was passed over, unused, until someone looked at what remained and saw a guardian waiting inside it. For long stretches of its long life, the Sphinx has been buried up to its shoulders in drifting desert sand, uncovered and reburied again and again across thousands of years, as though the desert itself kept trying to tuck it in for a long rest, only for people to keep gently waking it again. Isn't that a soft, strange comfort, that even something so ancient and watchful has been allowed, again and again, to disappear beneath soft sand for a while, resting unseen before being uncovered once more? You're allowed that too, tonight. A little disappearing, a little softness pulled up over you. But that is only one small part of the story. Long before it was ever a burial chamber, the very shape of the pyramid itself was thought to echo something older and more sacred. The benben, a small, pointed sacred stone believed to represent the very first mound of earth that rose out of the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation, according to ancient Egyptian belief. In that story, before anything else existed, there was only dark, endless water, until one day a single mound of dry land emerged, and upon it the sun first rose. The pyramid's shape, tapering upward to a single point, was meant to echo that first mound, a symbol of creation itself, of order rising gently out of formlessness, of solid ground appearing where before there had been only depth and dark. Every pyramid, in that sense, was a quiet reenactment of the very beginning of the world, built new each time a king passed on, so that creation itself might happen again for him. You don't need to understand chaos to trust that order can rise gently out of it. Your tired thoughts tonight, however scattered, however formless they feel, can settle the same way, quietly, without effort, into one small, still point. The way that first ancient mound is said to have risen, unhurried, out of the dark water. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The interior of a pyramid, especially deep within its central chambers, holds a kind of silence that's hard to find almost anywhere else on the surface of the earth. No wind, no birdsong, no distant traffic, just thick stone in every direction, swallowing sound almost as soon as it's made. Visitors who have stood inside the king's chamber describe an odd, hollow resonance, a faint hum in their own ears that seems to come from the stone itself, though it's really only the sound of their own blood and breath, amplified by the absence of anything else to hear. In that kind of silence, a person becomes strangely aware of their own aliveness, the soft thud of a heartbeat, the quiet rush of breath moving in and out, sounds that are usually lost beneath the noise of an ordinary day. Down there, in that ancient dark, there is nothing left to listen to except yourself, quietly continuing. You can borrow a little of that stone quiet right now. Let the room around you get just a little softer, a little dimmer in your mind, until the only sound left worth noticing is your own breath, quietly continuing the way it has continued, faithfully, every single day of your life so far. But that is only one small part of the story. Some pyramids contain narrow shafts, barely wide enough for a hand, that run from the king's chamber and queen's chamber out toward the exterior of the pyramid at very specific angles. For a long time, they were assumed to simply be for airflow. But careful measurement later revealed something else. Several of these shafts appear to point, with real precision, toward particular stars or star patterns visible in the ancient Egyptian night sky, including the constellation we now call Orion, and the ever-visible circumpolar stars that never dip below the horizon. In ancient Egyptian belief, those circumpolar stars, the ones that circle the pole endlessly without ever setting, represented eternity itself, since they alone never disappeared beneath the horizon the way the sun and other stars did each night. A shaft pointed toward them may have been meant as a kind of path, a directed opening through which the king's soul could travel directly upward, out of the stone, and into a part of the sky that never went dark. Tonight, you don't need a stone shaft to find your own quiet path upward and outward, out of your thoughts and into rest. you can simply imagine one small opening somewhere behind your closed eyes, leading gently up and away towards somewhere calm that never quite goes dark. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every pyramid at Giza is enormous. Clustered near the three Great Pyramids are several much smaller ones, built for queens and close royal family members, modest in scale, but built with the same careful geometry as their larger neighbors. Standing beside the Great Pyramid, they look almost like children standing beside apparent, smaller echoes of the same quiet, patient shape. These smaller pyramids remind us that the pyramid form itself wasn't only for the most powerful. It was a shared language of stone, used at different scales for different people, all expressing the same wish in different sizes. The wish to be remembered gently, to rest safely, to have some lasting shape mark the place where a life had been. Not everything worth building has to be the largest version of itself. A small, quiet pyramid of rest tonight, modest and unremarkable, is still built from the very same careful geometry as anything grander. You don't need the biggest version of sleep tonight, just a gentle, well-made one. But that is only one small part of the story. Each major pyramid was originally connected to a mortuary temple built at its base. And from there, a long, covered causeway ran down toward a second temple near the edge of the Nile floodplain, called a valley temple, where the king's body would arrive by boat and begin its final ceremonial journey up toward the pyramid itself. Priests would perform rituals along the way, including the delicate, symbolic act of opening the mouth of the king's statue or mummy, believed to restore the senses to the dead so they could eat, speak, and see again in the next life. Imagine that slow procession, boats arriving from the river, incense drifting on dry desert air, a long walk up a covered stone corridor from water toward mountain, from the world of the living toward the eternal shape waiting above. Every part of it was designed to be unhurried, ceremonial, deliberate. Nothing about it was meant to be rushed. Let your own descent into sleep tonight borrow a little of that same unhurried ceremony. Not something to be rushed toward, but something to be walked into slowly, calmly, one soft step at a time, like a procession, moving gently from noise toward stillness. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The ancient Egyptians had no advanced calculus, no modern surveying tools. Yet the mathematics folded quietly into pyramid proportions still surprises people today. The ratio between the height of the Great Pyramid and half the length of its base sits remarkably close to a well-known mathematical constant. And while scholars still debate how deliberate this really was, there's something lovely in even the possibility. that a civilization reaching for the eternal might have stumbled gently and without fanfare into deep mathematical harmony, simply by trying to make something feel balanced and right to the eye, whether by careful design or by an instinct for proportion so refined it echoes mathematics without needing the formulas. The result is the same, a shape that feels, even now, deeply, wordlessly correct. Something in the human eye and mind seems able to recognize balance long before it can explain it. You don't have to explain why rest feels right tonight either. You don't need the formula for it. You only need to let your body recognize the balance of stillness, the way ancient eyes recognized the balance of a well-proportioned shape without needing a single equation to prove it. But that is only one small part of the story. By the time later pharaohs were burying their dead, they largely stopped building pyramids altogether, choosing instead to carve hidden tombs deep into a remote desert valley later, called the Valley of the Kings. Tombs meant not to be seen, but to disappear entirely from view, tucked into cliffs and covered over, precisely because the great, gleaming pyramids had proven too visible, too tempting a target for tomb robbers seeking gold and treasure. It's a quiet, almost melancholy turn in the story. A civilization that once built the most visible monuments on Earth, eventually deciding that true safety, true rest, required disappearing instead. Perhaps there's wisdom folded into that shift too. Not everything precious needs to be monumental or seen. Sometimes the safest, most protected rest is the quiet, hidden kind. Wherever you are right now, you don't need to be visible or monumental either. You're allowed the hidden, protected kind of rest tonight, tucked away, unseen, entirely safe. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Far south of Egypt, in the ancient kingdom once called Kush, in what is now Sudan, another people built pyramids of their own, smaller, steeper, more numerous than Egypt's. Over 200 of them clustered in the desert at a site called Meroe. Their sides rise at a much sharper angle than Egypt's smooth, wide-based pyramids, giving them a slender, almost flame-like silhouette against the horizon. For a long time, these Nubian pyramids received far less attention from the wider world than their Egyptian cousins, quietly standing in the desert, some now weathered and partially collapsed. A whole other chapter of pyramid building history, existing almost in the shadow of its more famous northern neighbor. They remind us that the impulse to build something eternal out of stone wasn't confined to one river valley alone. It was a wider human impulse, echoed differently wherever it took root. Sometimes the quieter, less famous version of something holds just as much meaning as the version everyone already knows about. Your own quiet, ordinary night to night, unphotographed, unremarked upon, entirely yours, matters exactly as much as any grand, well-known one. But that is only one small part of the story. For all we've learned, real uncertainty still surrounds exactly how the largest stones were lifted so high. Some blocks near the pyramid's upper reaches would have needed to be raised well over 100 meters into the air using only ropes, sledges, levers, and human effort. Various ramp theories exist. A single straight ramp, a spiraling ramp winding up the outside, an internal ramp hidden within the pyramid's own structure. And each has evidence both for and against it, with no single answer yet fully agreed upon by everyone who studies it. There's something quietly comforting in that unresolved mystery. Actually, not every ancient question needs a tidy, certain answer to still feel meaningful. The not knowing itself can be a kind of resting place, a soft, unfinished edge where wonder is allowed to simply remain wonder, rather than being pinned down and explained away entirely. You don't need every thought tonight to resolve into a tidy answer either. Some things can simply stay open, unresolved, softly mysterious, while you rest anyway. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. Already unimaginably ancient to him, the way the pyramids are unimaginably ancient to us now, only more so. He wrote down stories he'd been told by local guides and priests, some of them clearly exaggerated, some almost certainly wrong, describing enormous numbers of laborers and long years of toil. In a strange way, he was one of history's very first tourists, a curious traveler standing exactly where you might imagine yourself standing, looking up, asking questions, trying to understand something built so long before his own lifetime that its true story had already begun slipping quietly into legend. Curiosity, it turns out, is one of humanity's oldest and steadiest companions, unbroken across thousands of years. Your own curiosity tonight, gentle and half asleep as it is, connects you to something very old and very human. A long, unbroken thread of people looking up at something vast, wondering softly, and simply letting the wondering be enough. But that is only one small part of the story. Preparing a body for its journey into the afterlife was a long, unhurried process, often taking a full 70 days from beginning to end. The internal organs, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines, were carefully removed and preserved separately in 4 vessels called canopic jars, each one protected in belief by a different guardian spirit. The heart, uniquely, was almost always left in place, considered the seat of thought and feeling, too important to be set aside from the body it belonged to. The body itself was then dried slowly using natron, a natural salt gathered from dry lake beds drawing out moisture over many weeks until nothing remained that could decay. Only then was it wrapped, layer upon careful layer of linen, each layer smoothed and settled before the next was added, the whole process closer to a long, patient vigil than a single, hurried procedure. There's something worth borrowing in that unhurried pace. The idea that preparing something fragile for a long journey isn't done all at once, but slowly, layer by careful layer, with real patience given to every single step. Let your own body be wrapped tonight in that same unhurried patience, one soft layer of stillness settling gently over the last. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Along the banks of the Nile, ancient Egyptians built and maintained devices called nilometers, simple stone stairways, or marked columns descending into the river, used to measure exactly how high the annual flood rose each year. A good, generous flood meant a good harvest ahead. A weak one meant a harder year to come. Priests and officials would read these markings, each season the way we might check a forecast, translating a rising river into a quiet promise about the months ahead. There's something steadying in a civilization that built its whole sense of the future around watching one patient, recurring rhythms so closely, not trying to control the river, only learning, year after year, to read it clearly and trust what it told them. You don't need to control tonight either. You can simply read it the way they read the river, watching gently, trusting what it quietly tells you, letting the rest unfold exactly as it will. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. At certain times of year, the setting sun aligns almost perfectly between the Great Pyramid and its neighbor, appearing to sink directly into the narrow gap between the two structures when viewed from precisely the right spot to the west. Photographers and sky watchers still gather for this alignment today, watching a moment of light and stone and shadow line up the way it may have been intended to, thousands of years ago, by builders watching the same horizon. It's a small, quiet reminder that the pyramids were never meant to be static objects only. They were built to interact with light, with the sun's yearly path, with the sky itself, monuments in conversation with the heavens above them, not simply standing apart from them. Let yourself feel, tonight, a little of that same quiet alignment, your breathing lining up gently with the slow settling of the evening, your body and the darkening sky finally moving, for once, in the very same unhurried direction. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Egyptian scribes trained for years to master hundreds of hieroglyphic signs, practicing patiently on scraps of broken pottery called ostraca, before ever being trusted with the far more valuable papyrus. Made by slicing the pale inner pith of reeds grown along the Nile into thin strips, pressing and drying them into sturdy, pale sheets. Writing itself was considered a quiet, respected craft, And a good scribe's work, careful, evenly spaced, unhurried, could last for centuries in Egypt's famously dry air. Some of that ancient papyrus survives even now, its ink still dark, its careful lines of signs still legible, patient words waiting quietly for someone, someday, to read them again. Whatever words or thoughts feel unfinished in your own mind tonight, they don't need to be written down, perfected, or made permanent right now. They're allowed to simply stay soft and unrecorded, drifting gently, needing no scribe at all tonight. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every pyramid built after the Great Age of Giza was made of solid stone throughout. Some later pyramids, particularly during the Middle Kingdom, were constructed with a core of simple mud brick, faced only with an outer shell of finer limestone to give the appearance of the great monuments that came before. Once that outer shell was removed or worn away by time, the mud brick core beneath was left exposed to wind and rain. And many of these later pyramids crumbled far more quickly than their ancient, solid predecessors. There's an honest lesson folded quietly into that difference, that appearances, however convincing, aren't always what holds a thing together underneath. What truly lasts is rarely the polished outer shell alone. It's whatever solid, unglamorous material lies patiently beneath it. Whatever solid, unglamorous thing has been quietly holding you together today. Habit, routine, simple care. Let it be enough tonight, polished shell or not. It's already doing exactly what it needs to do. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Centuries later, in the late 1700s, French soldiers traveling with Napoleon's expedition into Egypt were struck by the sheer scale of the pyramids rising suddenly out of the desert haze. And one popular, but almost certainly invented story claims Napoleon told his troops that 40 centuries were looking down upon them. True or not, the sentiment captures something real, that standing before the pyramids has always made people acutely, almost dizzyingly aware of time itself, of how brief any single human life is against a backdrop that has simply continued patiently for thousands of years. That same expedition also brought European scholars into direct, sustained contact with ancient Egyptian writing for the first time in centuries, eventually helping unlock hieroglyphics through the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. A single slab of stone that quite unexpectedly opened an entire lost language back up to the world. You don't need 40 centuries looking down on you tonight. Only the quiet knowledge that time has always moved this patiently, this steadily, holding both ancient stone and tired bodies with exactly the same gentle indifference, the same eventual mercy. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. The entrance most visitors used to enter the Great Pyramid today isn't the original one at all. true, sealed entrance sits higher up on the north face, hidden carefully behind stone. The rough opening tourists pass through now was carved sometime in the 9th century by workers acting under a caliph named Al-Mamun, who forced his way in through solid rock, searching for treasure and knowledge said to be hidden deep within. By most accounts, he found the interior chambers already empty, long since disturbed by robbers who had somehow slipped in centuries before him, through routes no one has ever fully traced. There's something quietly humbling in that. Even the pyramid's most secret, most carefully sealed entrance couldn't stay secret forever. And yet, the structure itself never seemed to mind. It simply let itself be found, entered, searched, and still stood exactly as it had before, unbothered by the intrusion. Whatever careful defenses you've built around your own tender places, you don't need to guard them quite so tightly tonight. Even if something reaches in gently, you'll still stand afterward, exactly as steady as before. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The smallest of the 3 Great Pyramids at Giza, built for a king named Menkora, was left noticeably unfinished at the time of his death. Its lower courses meant to be cased in dark, polished granite, a striking contrast to the pale limestone above. But only a portion of that granite casing was ever completed before work stopped, leaving rough, unsmoothed stone exposed at the base. Even now, it's often overshadowed by its 2 enormous neighbors, smaller in scale, quieter in fame. Its unfinished granite, a visible reminder that even royal projects sometimes simply run out of time. And yet, it has stood, unfinished and unapologetic, for exactly as long as the others. You don't need to be the largest or the most finished version of anything tonight either. Unfinished and quiet is still allowed to stand just as steadily for just as long. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Egyptian royalty and gods alike were often depicted wearing a rearing cobra at the front of the crown, called a uraeus, believed to spit fire at approaching enemies and protect its wearer from harm. It appears again and again across thousands of years of Egyptian art, coiled calmly at the brow, a small, ever-present guardian built directly into the crown itself. There's something tender in imagining protection worn that close, that constantly, not a distant shield, but something small and steady, resting right at the forehead, quietly watching in every direction at once, never needing to be told to stay alert. You can imagine a little of that same quiet guardian settling over you now, resting gently at your brow, watching softly so that no part of you has to stay alert tonight. It has this covered. You can finally let go. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The vivid colors that once covered tomb and temple walls throughout ancient Egypt came from carefully ground minerals. A green from crushed malachite, a warm red-brown from iron-rich ochre, a rare and prized deep blue made by fusing sand, copper, and natron together into what's now called Egyptian blue, one of the very first synthetic pigments ever created by human hands. Traces of these colors still cling to sheltered wall surfaces even now, faint but unmistakably vivid, where sunlight and wind never quite reached them. There's something moving about color surviving in the dark far longer than it ever could have in the light, protected, ironically, by being hidden away, tucked into chambers no wind or sun could fade. Whatever bright, tender parts of you feel too easily faded by a difficult day, you can tuck them away safely tonight too, sheltered in the dark, quietly keeping their color for as long as they need to. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Of all the extraordinary structures the ancient world once celebrated as its 7 wonders, a lighthouse, a hanging garden, a colossal bronze statue standing astride a harbor, only one still stands today, largely intact, in something close to its original form: the Great Pyramid of Giza. Every other wonder on that ancient list has long since fallen to earthquake, fire, war, or simple time. It's a strange kind of quiet victory, isn't it? Not the flashiest wonder, not necessarily the most delicate or ornate, but the one built with such enormous patience and such careful, humble stone that it simply outlasted everything else on the list, without needing to compete or hurry or prove anything further. You don't need to be the flashiest version of rest tonight either. Just the steady, patient kind, plain stone, well placed, is enough to outlast anything the day tried to throw at you. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Deep within the pyramid at Medum, one of Sneferu's earlier building projects, something unusual happened at some point in ancient history. Much of the outer stone casing collapsed away, leaving behind only the pyramid's stepped inner core, standing today like a strange stone tower rising abruptly out of a great mound of rubble at its base. Locals have long called it El Haram El Kadab, the false pyramid, as if its failure to keep its smooth, finished shape somehow disqualified it from the name entirely. And yet it still stands, wounded, unfinished looking, its secret inner structure exposed for anyone to see. And still, after more than 4,000 years, refusing to fully fall. There's something quietly brave in that, a structure that lost its polished outer shell centuries ago, and simply kept standing anyway, imperfect and exposed, letting its inner framework hold firm even without its finished skin. Whatever feels unfinished or a little collapsed about you tonight, you're still standing. The outer polish isn't what's holding you up right now. Something steadier underneath is. Let that quiet, unseen structure hold you exactly as you are. But that is only one small part of the story. The Egyptians measured length using a unit called the royal cubit, based roughly on the length of a forearm from elbow to fingertip, plus the width of a palm. A wonderfully human way to measure the world, rooted not in some abstract standard, but in the body itself. The Great Pyramid's base, when measured this way, comes out to a strikingly round number of cubits, suggesting the builders were working from a very deliberate, carefully chosen plan from the very beginning, rather than improvising as they went. There's something tender about a civilization measuring mountains with the length of an arm, using the most human, most intimate unit available to plan something meant to outlast every human who would ever measure it. The body, however briefly it lasts, became the yardstick for eternity itself. Your own body, however tired it feels tonight, is doing something quietly similar, measuring out this moment of rest, cubit by cubit, breath by breath. In units only it truly understands. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not far from the Giza pyramids, workers left behind something unexpectedly domestic. An ancient bakery capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread a day, along with brewing vats for beer, discovered by archaeologists studying the nearby workers' town. The ovens were simple but efficient, built in rows, clearly designed for volume rather than delicacy, feeding a workforce that needed reliable, steady calories far more than refined cuisine. It's easy to imagine the pyramids only as stone and grandeur, forgetting entirely that behind every enormous block lifted into place was a person who had eaten breakfast that morning, who was hungry by midday, who went home or to a nearby dormitory, utterly exhausted each evening. The pyramids were built, quite literally, on bread and beer and rest. The same ordinary fuels that carry you through your own days now. Whatever ordinary, unremarkable things carried you through today, a meal, a short rest, a small kindness, they were enough. They're always enough. The extraordinary is always built, quietly, out of the ordinary. But that is only one small part of the story. The angle of the sun changes subtly with the seasons, and the pyramids, positioned so precisely, cast shadows that shift in length and direction throughout the year in ways that may have helped mark important dates on the ancient Egyptian calendar, including moments tied to the flooding of the Nile, the single most important agricultural event of the entire year. A structure built for the dead may also have quietly served the living, marking time for planting, waiting, and harvest. There's a gentle symmetry in that, a monument to the eternal also helping mark the passing of ordinary, cyclical time, the seasons turning gently and reliably, year after year, the way your own nights and days have turned reliably. carrying you steadily toward this particular one, right now. Let the turning of your own personal seasons, busy days, tired evenings, quiet mornings, feel as reliable and unthreatening as the pyramid's slow, shifting shadow. Everything comes back around, gently, in its own good time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Egyptian belief held that a person possessed several distinct parts of the soul, each with its own name and its own particular needs after death. The Ka, a kind of life force or double that required regular offerings of food and drink even after death. The Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, able to travel freely between the tomb and the world of the living. And the Ak, the transfigured, affective spirit, a person hopefully became once all the correct rituals had been properly performed. The pyramid, in that light, wasn't simply a tomb. It was closer to a kind of machine for the soul, carefully engineered with shafts, chambers, texts, and offerings, all designed to help these different parts of a person's spirit do exactly what they needed to do, each in its own way, none of them neglected. You too are made of more than just one simple, single part tonight. A tired body, a wandering mind, a quiet, unnamed something underneath both. Let all of those parts rest together now, none of them neglected, each held gently within this one quiet space. But that is only one small part of the story. At the Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest at Giza, the outer casing at the very top has actually survived far better than at the base, leaving a smooth, gleaming cap of white limestone still visible near its peak, even today. A rare surviving hint of how brilliantly all these structures once shone in full sunlight. From certain angles, in the right light, that cap still catches and throws back the sun, a small remaining fragment of a glow that once covered the entire structure. It's a strange kind of survival, not the base, which you'd expect to be sturdiest, but the peak, high and exposed, somehow the part that held onto its original brightness the longest. Sometimes what endures isn't what seems most protected. Sometimes it's simply what was cared for, positioned, and finished with the most attention. Whatever feels most exposed or vulnerable in you tonight might, in its own quiet way, also be the part best equipped to hold onto its brightness. You don't need to protect every part of yourself equally hard tonight. Just let the exposed places rest too. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before builders ever cut stone, ancient Egyptian farmers had already spent centuries mastering something the pyramids would later depend on entirely. The rhythm of the Nile's yearly flood, which arrived with such striking regularity that the entire Egyptian calendar was built around it, divided into 3 seasons named for flooding, growing, and harvest. That predictable rhythm gave Egyptian society something rare in the ancient world: enough stability and surplus food to support. For months at a time, thousands of workers who weren't growing their own crops. Without that reliable, repeating rhythm, none of the rest would have been possible. No surplus labor, no stored grain, no steady bread and beer, no pyramid. The whole vast, eternal project rested, quite literally, on a river's willingness to rise and fall in the same gentle pattern, year after year, without fail. Your own rest tonight can lean on rhythm too. The same reliable pattern your body has followed every night of your life, rising and falling like a tide, needing no permission, no effort, simply trusting the pattern to carry you the rest of the way. But that is only one small part of the story. Inside several later pyramids, alongside the spells meant to help a king's soul ascend, are lists, long, careful lists of offerings: bread, beer, cattle, fowl, linen, oil, meant to magically sustain the king in the afterlife, regardless of whether living priests kept bringing real offerings forever, which of course, eventually, no one could. The list itself, carved permanently into stone, was believed to function almost like a standing order, a promise written so firmly into the world that it would keep providing on its own, indefinitely, long after any living hand stopped delivering real bread. There's something oddly touching about that solution, anticipating that human memory and devotion would eventually fade, and building a permanent, self-sustaining backup directly into the stone itself, so that care, once carved, would never fully run out. Whatever care you weren't given today, or gave yourself only briefly, you can carve a small, permanent version of it into this moment now. A standing order for rest, for softness, that doesn't depend on anyone remembering to deliver it. It's already here. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The pyramids at Giza weren't built in isolation. They were part of an enormous, carefully planned royal necropolis, a whole city for the dead complete, with cemeteries for officials and nobles arranged in neat rows near the great royal tombs, almost like a community gathered gently around its center. Even in death, it seems, people wanted to be near something larger than themselves, arranged not randomly, but with quiet, deliberate closeness. There's a soft comfort in that image, rows of smaller tombs clustered protectively near the towering pyramids, as if proximity itself offered a kind of safety, a kind of belonging, even in the stillness of the afterlife. No one, it seems, wanted to rest entirely alone. You don't have to rest entirely alone tonight either, even if you're the only one in the room. This voice, low and steady, is simply keeping quiet company nearby, the way those smaller tombs once kept quiet company beside something vast. But that is only one small part of the story. Modern scanning technology, including cosmic ray imaging that can see straight through solid stone, has revealed hidden voids inside the Great Pyramid that no one previously knew existed, including a large, mysterious space above the Grand Gallery, roughly the size of a passenger airplane, whose purpose remains completely unknown even now. No entrance has been found. No one has stepped inside it. It simply sits there, sealed, unexplained, waiting. Even after everything scholars have learned across centuries of careful study, the Great Pyramid still holds at least one entirely private, unopened room. In a world where so much has been mapped, measured, and explained, there's something quietly beautiful about a 4,000-year-old structure still keeping one small secret entirely to itself. You're allowed a private, unopened room tonight too, some small, sealed space inside you that no one else needs to see, map, or explain. It can simply stay closed, held safely, while the rest of you rests easy around it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. As the pyramid building era wound down over the centuries, later Egyptian rulers occasionally looked back at the Great Pyramids of Giza, not as engineering feats to surpass, but as sacred, ancient monuments to be respected, restored, and even worshipped in their own right. Some New Kingdom pharaohs, ruling well over 1,000 years after Khufu, ordered repairs and left inscriptions honoring these already ancient structures, treating them the way we might treat a cathedral or an ancient forest, something to preserve rather than replace. Imagine that vast stretch of time folded quietly inside a single monument, a structure so old that even other ancient Egyptians, themselves impossibly distant from us now, looked upon it as a relic from a much older world than their own. Time, layered upon time, upon time. You don't need to be the newest, most current version of anything tonight either. You're allowed to simply be old and steady, and quietly respected by your own tired self, the way even ancient people once looked back with reverence at something older still. But that is only one small part of the story. Somewhere along one interior wall of the Great Pyramid, deep inside one of those small, hidden relieving chambers above the king's chamber, quarry marks are still visible today. Quick, rough hieratic script painted directly onto stone that was never meant to be seen again once construction finished, including the name of Khufu himself, along with the names of work gangs, dates, and simple notations meant only to keep track of which stones came from where. These weren't formal royal inscriptions meant to impress anyone. They were working notes, practical and unglamorous, left by people simply doing their jobs. never imagining that thousands of years later, careful eyes with flashlights would crawl into that same tiny, dusty space just to read them. Some of the truest, most honest traces we leave behind aren't the polished, formal parts of ourselves at all. They're the quick, practical, unglamorous notes, the ones written only for the moment, never meant to last, that somehow end up lasting the longest anyway. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Between the pyramids, the desert itself changes character depending on the hour. At midday, the sand and stone shimmer under relentless heat, pale and blinding. But in the deep hush of night, the same desert cools dramatically, sometimes dropping close to freezing even after a scorching day. The sky above turning startlingly clear and dense with stars, far more visible there than in almost any modern city. Ancient builders working through certain phases of construction would have known both extremes intimately. Blazing days spent moving stone, and cold, star-crowded nights spent resting nearby, watching a sky far darker and far busier with light than most of us ever get to see now. Let a little of that ancient night sky settle over you tonight, even if you can't actually see it. Endless, cool, dense, with quiet, distant light, utterly unhurried, asking absolutely nothing of you except to lie still beneath it. But that is only one small part of the story. Long before any pyramid rose from the sand, Egyptian nobles were buried beneath flat-roofed, rectangular structures called mastabas. Low, sturdy benches of mud brick or stone built directly over underground burial chambers. The word itself comes from an Arabic term for a simple bench, the kind you might find outside a village home, because that's exactly what these early tombs resembled from a distance. A long, low seat placed quietly over the dead. Djoser's step pyramid, in a sense, was really just 6 mastabas stacked one on top of another, each slightly smaller than the one beneath it, as though Imhotep had taken something ordinary and familiar and simply kept adding to it, layer after layer, until an entirely new kind of monument emerged almost by accident of accumulation. Even the most extraordinary shapes, it seems, often begin as something humble, repeated patiently, until it becomes something else entirely. Whatever simple, ordinary comfort helped you through today, a chair, a bench, a familiar low shape to rest against, you can let it stack gently now, one soft layer after another, into something tall and safe enough to hold you through the night. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Around Djoser's step pyramid, archaeologists uncovered an entire ghostly complex of stone buildings that were never meant to be truly used at all. Doors carved from solid stone that don't actually open. Chambers too narrow for a living person to comfortably enter. An entire courtyard built for a ceremony called the Hebsed. a ritual race the king would have run in life to prove his strength and fitness to keep ruling. Except here, carved forever in stone, the king could perform that race eternally, in spirit, without ever tiring. It's an oddly touching idea, building an entire stage set for the afterlife, false doors and all, so that a king's spirit could keep doing, gently and endlessly, the small rituals that once mattered to him in life. Not grand new adventures, just the familiar motions, repeated forever, comforting in their sameness. You don't need a grand new adventure tonight either. Just the familiar, comforting motions of rest, repeated the same way they always are, safe in their sameness, asking nothing new of you at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Deep inside the Pyramid of Giza, the same one holding those very first pyramid texts, the ceiling of the burial chamber was painted a deep, dark blue, and scattered with carefully placed 5-pointed stars, turning the stone roof overhead into a private, permanent night sky. Even sealed away from actual daylight and actual stars, the king's resting place was given its own painted heaven to rest beneath, so that darkness itself would never truly be empty. There's something quietly lovely in that gesture, knowing that real starlight would never reach that sealed chamber again, and choosing to paint the stars there anyway, patiently, star by star, simply so the space would feel less like an ending and more like a sky. Wherever you are resting right now, you can borrow that same gentle gesture, even if the room around you is ordinary, even if no real stars are visible tonight. You're allowed to imagine a soft, painted sky overhead anyway, dark blue, scattered with quiet points of light, keeping you gentle company. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In 2013, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable set of papyrus fragments in caves near the Red Sea coast, written by a man named Murr, who led a team of workers transporting fine white limestone by boat from a quarry across the Nile to the Great Pyramid's construction site. It is, quite simply, the oldest inscribed papyrus ever found in Egypt, and it reads almost like a logbook: dates, tasks, the number of trips made, the small, repetitive details of ordinary work. Murr's diary doesn't describe kings or gods or grand ceremony. It describes departures and arrivals, loading and unloading, the everyday rhythm of a job done again and again, until a pyramid, somehow, slowly rose out of all that ordinary repetition. A 4,000-year-old to-do list, in its own way, patiently kept. Your own day, too, was probably made of small, repetitive tasks rather than grand moments, and that's all right. Pyramids were built one ordinary boat trip at a time. Rest tonight can be built the very same unremarkable way. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Near that same stretch of Red Sea coastline, Murr's team had constructed a harbor, one of the oldest known in the world, complete with storage galleries carved into rock and coils of rope so well preserved by the dry climate that some fibers remain supple even now. Thousands of years later, ropes made from twisted plant fiber, tied by hands that vanished long ago, somehow outlasting the very civilization that wove them. It's strange and quietly moving to think of rope, something so ordinary, so easily discarded, so unremarkable in daily life, becoming one of the most delicate, improbable survivors of an entire ancient world. Sometimes the smallest, most overlooked things turn out to be the ones that last the longest, simply because no one ever thought to notice them enough to destroy them. Whatever small, unremarkable part of you got you through today, a habit, a routine, a quiet coping thread you don't think much about, it may be sturdier than you realize. Let it hold you gently now, the way that ancient rope, forgotten and ordinary, somehow still holds its shape. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Egyptian priests kept careful track of nighttime hours, using what are called decans, specific groupings of stars that rose above the horizon at regular intervals throughout the night, each marking the passing of roughly 1 hour. Charts of these star groups were sometimes painted on the ceilings of tombs and temples, turning the night sky into something almost like a slow, celestial clock, ticking gently from one star to the next. There's something soothing in imagining time this way, not measured in harsh mechanical ticks, but in the slow, unhurried rising of familiar stars, one gentle marker at a time, each one simply appearing when it was ready to appear, never early, never rushed. Let the minutes tonight pass the same unhurried way, not counted, not watched anxiously, but simply allowed to rise and pass on their own gentle schedule. One soft, familiar marker drifting quietly by after another. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The pharaoh Khafre, builder of the second Giza pyramid, commissioned an enormous statue of himself, carved from a single, dark, mottled stone, seated calmly on a throne with a falcon god's wings wrapped protectively around the back of his head. A visual promise that even a mortal king was cradled quietly and constantly by something larger and more watchful than himself. The statue has survived remarkably intact for well over 4,000 years, its calm expression unchanged through every century that has passed around it. There's a soft reassurance folded into that ancient image, the idea that even the most powerful person in the land still needed and still accepted the sense of being watched over, held, protected by something bigger than himself. Strength and softness, it seems, were never considered opposites there. You're allowed that same quiet protection tonight. Whatever wings real or imagined, once wrapped gently around you as a child. You can imagine settling around you again, now calm, watchful, and entirely unhurried. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Inside the Great Pyramid's king's chamber sits a single sarcophagus carved from dark red granite, slightly too wide to have fit through the narrow passages built afterward. Meaning, it must have been placed inside the chamber during construction itself, before the walls around it were finished, sealed permanently into the room it would occupy forever. When it was finally opened by explorers many centuries later, it was found completely empty, its original occupant long since gone, likely removed sometime during the long, uncertain centuries between the Old Kingdom and later dynasties. There's something quietly poignant about an empty stone box, cut with such enormous care and precision, waiting patiently for thousands of years for an occupant who, in the end, never stayed. And yet the sarcophagus itself remains, steady and undisturbed, exactly where it was placed, regardless of what it does or doesn't hold. Whatever feels a little empty in you tonight, you don't need to fill it right now. You can simply remain steady and undisturbed exactly where you are, the way that quiet stone box has remained steady, waiting, unbothered by absence. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not far from the Great Pyramid, an unfinished, roughly hewn boulder of pink granite lies half buried in the sand, abandoned partway through being carved into what would have been an enormous statue or architectural piece. A small, silent monument to work simply left undone. No explanation survives for why it was abandoned. Perhaps a crack appeared. Perhaps priorities shifted. Perhaps, simply, someone decided it wasn't needed after all. It's oddly comforting, in its own quiet way, proof that even in a civilization famous for finishing the impossible, some things were simply left unfinished, without apology, without a recorded reason. And the world continued on regardless, no worse for the incompleteness. Whatever feels unfinished in your own day, your own week, your own plans, it's allowed to simply stay that way tonight, half carved and resting in the quiet sand, needing no explanation, no apology, no urgent completion. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Small, just a little more, and then we'll rest. The pyramids have survived earthquakes. They've survived thousands of years of wind, scouring sand, and shifting temperature. They've survived empires rising and falling around them, entire civilizations arriving and vanishing while the stones simply stayed. There's a certain steadiness in that, a patience older than memory. If your day felt shaky, unsteady, unfinished, you don't have to fix it tonight. You only have to be still. The stone was still for centuries before anyone noticed how still it was. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some pyramid blocks show faint traces of the original tool marks left behind by copper chisels, soft metal, easily dulled, requiring constant resharpening throughout each long day of careful, repetitive work. Iron tools didn't exist yet in ancient Egypt during the Pyramid Age. Everything was cut, shaped, and smoothed using copper, stone hammers, and simple abrasives like sand itself, rubbed patiently against harder surfaces until they gave way. It's almost unbelievable, in the softest sense, that something so permanent and vast could be shaped using tools so comparatively soft and simple. Patience, it seems, was the real tool here, endless, repeated, gentle effort, applied again and again, long enough for even the hardest stone to slowly yield its shape. Whatever feels too hard or too immovable in your own mind tonight doesn't need force either. Just soft, repeated attention, applied gently again and again, until it slowly, quietly yields. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Small, quiet things. A single grain of sand, 2 million of them roughly, could fit inside just one modest handful. Now imagine 2 million stone blocks instead, each one carried, placed, adjusted, by hands that are long gone now, resting somewhere far beyond memory. And still, what those hands built remains. Let your own hands rest now too. Whatever they carried today, they can set it down. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Beside several major pyramids stands a much smaller companion structure, sometimes called a satellite or cult pyramid, built specifically to house a symbolic double of the king's spirit, his Ka, separate entirely from the tomb, holding his physical body nearby. It wasn't meant for burial in the usual sense. It was meant simply as a second, smaller home for one particular part of him, so that even his spirit, in a sense, would have somewhere quiet of its own to rest. There's something gentle in that layered idea of self, that a person might need more than one resting place, one part of them settled here, another part settled just beside it, each held separately, but never far apart. Whatever different, tired parts of you are drifting tonight, body, thoughts, that quiet, underlying feeling beneath both. Each one is allowed its own small, separate corner to rest in, close together, none of them alone. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before hourglasses or clocks, Egyptian priests watched for a single, specific event each year. The moment just before dawn when the bright star Sirius, which they called Sopdet, first became visible again on the eastern horizon after months of being lost in the sun's glare. That single sunrise reappearance, called a heliacal rising, was used to mark the beginning of a new year, arriving with almost perfect regularity, just as the Nile's flood was about to begin. A star, quietly vanishing and quietly returning, used to measure the turning of an entire year. There's There's something soothing in a system built not on rigid numbers, but on watching patiently for something familiar to simply come back around, right on time, exactly as it always had. Whatever feels lost to you right now, a mood, a sense of ease, a good night's rest, it tends to come back around too, quietly, right on time, the way that one steady star always has. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Tucked inside several ancient tombs near the pyramids, archaeologists have found sets of a board game called Senet, played on a long grid of 30 squares, with carved pieces moved according to the throw of simple sticks or bones. One of the oldest board games known anywhere in the world. Paintings show pharaohs and nobles playing it for simple pleasure. But over time, it also took on a deeper meaning, symbolizing the soul's journey through the dangers of the afterlife toward final, peaceful rest. A game played first for nothing more than a quiet evening's enjoyment, slowly becoming a symbol for something far larger, proof, in its own small way, that play and meaning were never really separate things there. There's no need to separate them for yourself tonight either. Whatever small, playful comfort helped ease your evening, a show, a game, an idle scroll, it was allowed to matter, gently, exactly as much as anything more serious. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. A popular modern claim holds that the Great Pyramid is visible to the naked eye from outer space, a striking image, but not really an accurate one. From orbit, it's a small, pale shape, easily lost against the vast, tan expanse of desert surrounding it. No more visible than most large buildings, needing far more than unaided human eyesight to pick out clearly. There's something almost sweeter in the true scale of it than in the myth. Not vast enough to see from space, but vast enough that 2 million people, working patiently over 20 years, could still barely finish it in a single lifetime. Human-sized vastness, rather than impossible vastness, built by hands, not by magic. You don't need impossible, space-visible proof of anything tonight either. Just the quiet, human-sized truth that today happened, that you got through it, one patient hour at a time, is more than enough. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The word pyramid itself doesn't come from ancient Egyptian at all. It likely comes from the ancient Greek word pyramis, possibly related to a kind of wheat cake with a similar tapering shape, or perhaps simply describing the geometric form itself. The Egyptians had their own word, myrrh, for these structures, a word we rarely use today, quietly replaced over centuries by outside eyes, describing what they saw in their own language instead. There's something gentle and a little bittersweet in that. Even a monument's very name eventually drifted away from the people who built it, renamed by later travelers looking up at something they hadn't built themselves, doing their best to describe it anyway. You don't need the exact right words for how you feel tonight either. Close enough will do. Gentle description is enough. No one needs the precise original word for rest, only the soft shape of it, however you happen to name it. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Far out in the eastern desert, ancient quarry workers cut a pale, honey-colored stone called travertine, sometimes still known by its old name, Egyptian alabaster. It isn't fully solid to the eye. Held up to a flame, it glows faintly from within, letting a soft light pass right through it. Temple lamps and offering vessels were often carved from it, so that even ordinary lamplight, filtered through that pale stone, took on something gentle and honeyed. Whatever light is nearest you right now, let it feel that soft. Let it pass through you gently too, warm and low, asking nothing. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Egyptians believed that after death, a person's heart would be placed on a scale and weighed against a single feather, a quiet test of whether a life had been lived with balance and honesty rather than greed or cruelty. Not against a list of grand achievements, not against wealth or fame or how much had been built. Just balance, simple, quiet balance. A feather is nearly weightless. So, in its own way, is a life well lived, carried lightly, without excess weight of guilt or grasping. Let your own heart feel that light tonight. Nothing heavy to carry. Nothing to weigh against anything at all. Just resting evenly, gently, like a feather settling on still air. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Much of the gold used to gild capstones, jewelry, and temple doors came from mines far to the south, in ancient Nubia. A name some scholars believe may even be related to an old word for gold itself. Miners worked in punishing desert heat, extracting a metal so soft it could be hammered thin enough to let light pass faintly through it, then layered carefully over harder stone or wood beneath. Gold, in the end, was never really about weight or wealth to the people using it this way. It was about permanence, a metal that doesn't rust, doesn't dull, doesn't decay the way almost everything else eventually does. You don't need to be made of gold tonight to deserve that same gentle permanence. Just this one quiet night, undecaying, held safely, exactly as it is. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Among the many symbols carved and painted throughout tombs and temples is a simple pillar shape, wider at the top than the bottom, called the jed, representing stability, the steady backbone of the world itself, sometimes linked to the spine of a god, long associated with rebirth and renewal. Raising the jed pillar upright, in ancient ritual, symbolized restoring order after chaos, standing something steady back up after it had fallen. There's a quiet, physical comfort in that image stability, not as something distant or abstract, but as an actual shape, something raised gently upright, over and over, whenever it was needed. Whatever in you feels like it's leaning, tilted, or unsteady tonight, you can imagine it being lifted slowly and gently back to standing, not forced, just quietly, patiently set upright again. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. After the great age of pyramid building slowly faded, many of the smaller, less protected pyramids scattered across Egypt were simply left to the desert. No more robbers to worry about, no more repairs, no more priests bringing offerings. Sand crept in through broken doorways. Wind smoothed sharp edges into soft, rounded slopes. Centuries passed, quietly, patiently, with no one watching. Some of those pyramids are barely recognizable now, just low mounds rising gently from the desert floor, indistinguishable, almost, from natural hills. There's no sadness needed in that. Even monuments are allowed to soften slowly back into the landscape they came from. You're allowed that softening too, tonight, edges rounding gently, thoughts smoothing quietly, everything sinking, unhurried, back into rest. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient Egyptians looked up at the pale, misty band of the Milky Way and saw in it a kind of heavenly river, a sky Nile, flowing quietly overhead the same way the real Nile flowed below, carrying gods and stars along its gentle current instead of boats and barges. Two rivers, then, one below, muddy and warm, carrying grain and stone and ordinary daily life. One above, pale and silent, carrying something far less easy to name. You don't need to name what's carrying you tonight either. Only trust that, like both those rivers, it's moving gently, steadily, taking you somewhere calm without needing to be watched every second to keep flowing. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Excavations of the animal bones discarded by workers near the Giza pyramids turned up something unexpected. Large quantities of cattle, sheep, and goat remains. Evidence of a diet far richer in meat than most ordinary Egyptians would have eaten in daily life. Feeding thousands of laborers this well, this consistently, would have required an enormous, carefully organized supply chain of herders, butchers, and transporters, all quietly working just to keep the builders fed. It suggests something gentler than the old picture of grim, forced labor, a workforce that mattered enough to be fed generously, cared for deliberately, kept strong enough to keep going. Whatever fed and carried you through today, however small it felt, it was part of its own quiet supply chain of care. You were allowed to be looked after today. You're allowed to be looked after now, too. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. At Dashur, near one of Sneferu's early pyramids, a later capstone was found lying in the sand, not far from a pyramid built centuries afterward for a king named Amenemhat. Carved from polished black granite, its sloped sides covered in careful inscriptions, and a pair of wide, watchful eyes facing east toward the rising sun. Unlike the gold-covered capstones of the earliest pyramids, this one was left dark and unpolished on top, so that only the sun itself, striking it directly at dawn, would make it briefly gleam. There's something quietly moving about a stone built to stay ordinary and dim most of the time, only catching light and meaning for a few brief moments each day, at exactly the right angle, in exactly the right light. You don't have to gleam constantly either. A few brief moments of brightness a day, caught at just the right angle, are more than enough. The rest of the time, you're allowed to simply be quiet, dark stone, resting. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. For all their scale, the ancient Egyptians who built these pyramids had no wheel-driven machinery to help them. No pulleys, no cranes. The wheel itself wasn't yet in common use for heavy construction work in Egypt during this era. Everything depended instead on the much simpler mechanics of ropes, wooden sledges, levers, and enormous numbers of coordinated hands pulling together at exactly the same steady rhythm, guided by voice and drumbeat to stay in time with one another. There's something almost startling in that simplicity. No hidden machinery, no secret shortcut, just patient, coordinated human effort, repeated so many times, so carefully, that it eventually added up to something that still stands, unmoved, 4,500 years later. Whatever felt hard today, you didn't need hidden machinery to get through it either. Just patient, repeated effort, one steady pull at a time. And here you are, resting, having made it through. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In the 14th century, a powerful earthquake shook the region around Cairo, loosening many of the pyramids' remaining polished casing stones, some of which tumbled down and settled at the base, easier than ever to remove. In the centuries that followed, builders steadily carried much of that fine white limestone away, stone by stone, to build mosques, city walls, and the great citadel overlooking Cairo, so that pieces of the Great Pyramid's original gleaming surface now quietly rest inside buildings still standing in the modern city today. It's a strange, gentle kind of continuity. Stone that once wrapped a king's eternal resting place slowly finding its way into new walls, new doorways, new quiet corners of ordinary daily life, still sheltering people, just in an entirely different form. Nothing tonight has to stay in its original shape to still matter. Whatever softened or shifted in you today, some quiet part of it may simply be settling into a new shape now, still sheltering you, just differently than before. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Almost done now. Let your breathing settle even further, deeper, slower, like like sand finally coming to rest at the bottom of an hourglass after all the falling is done. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Even now, new discoveries are still quietly emerging from beneath the sand. A previously unknown chamber here, an overlooked inscription there, a small fragment of papyrus describing, in surprising day-to-day detail, the life of a work supervisor moving stone by boat along the Nile. 4,500 years later, and the pyramids are still, very gently, telling us new things. There's something soothing in that slowness, a story this old, still unfolding at its own unhurried pace, refusing to be rushed even by our modern impatience for answers. Some stories are simply meant to keep opening slowly, gift after small gift, for as long as anyone is willing to keep listening. Your own story tonight doesn't need to finish either. It can simply keep opening, slowly, gently, long after you've stopped listening for it. Now, let all of this soften into impression rather than fact. You don't need to hold onto stone or sand or star shafts or granite. You don't need to remember Imhotep's name or Sneferu's bent angle or the exact weight of a single block. Let it all blur gently together into one warm, wordless feeling, something vast, something patient, something that took its time and was better for it. Let your body return fully to this room now, this bed, this quiet dark. Let your breathing be even slower than before, barely a whisper of movement. Let your shoulders be heavier, sinking, settled. Let your hands be still. Let your whole day, every part of it, finally loosen its grip completely. Above you, whether you can see it right now or not, the sky is still doing what it has always done. Stars are circling slowly, patiently, the way they circled above patient builders 4,500 years ago, the way they'll keep circling long after tonight, long after every worry you carried today has softened into something small and forgettable. The earth keeps turning, unhurried, indifferent in the kindest possible way, carrying you gently through the dark toward morning, whether you notice or not. Your mind, tonight, is only doing what minds always do, trying quietly to make sense of the day behind it, sorting, softening, letting go of what it doesn't need to carry forward. You don't have to help it along. You don't have to organize a single thought. Just let this slow, steady voice hold the space for a little while, so your mind doesn't have to hold anything at all. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well, and good night.